Welcome back to our channel, where we delve into the darkest corners of history to uncover stories that will send shivers down your spine. Tonight, we're taking you back to the summer of 1863, a time when the Battle of Gettysburg raged just 300 miles north, but in the rolling hills of Middle Tennessee, something far more sinister was unfolding. Federal investigators would later discover that 73 people had vanished without a trace from a single cotton plantation over the course of just 18 months. These weren't escaped slaves or deserting soldiers, they were free workers, hired hands, and even neighboring families who had simply asked too many questions about the Chamberlain family's impossible prosperity during America's bloodiest war. The official records were sealed by military order and buried in Washington archives, hidden from the world for over a century. What makes this case truly terrifying is not just the number of victims, but the methodical precision with which they were eliminated. Their belongings were cataloged like inventory, and their bodies dissolved in chemical baths, leaving no trace for grieving families to mourn. Tonight, we're going to uncover what really happened behind the whitewashed columns of Rosewood Manor, and why the most successful cotton dynasty in wartime Tennessee built their fortune on a foundation of 73 unmarked graves that were never meant to be disturbed. Before we dive deeper into the story of Ezekiel Chamberlain and his cursed empire, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of our chilling tales. And let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our community of dark history enthusiasts what we discovered in the military archives about the Chamberlain family's true business model will shake you to your core. Rosewood Manor stood like a gleaming monument to Southern prosperity in Rutherford County, Tennessee, just 20 miles southeast of Nashville. Built in 1834 by Ezekiel Chamberlain's father, the plantation had weathered economic storms that destroyed lesser estates, but by 1863, while neighboring plantations struggled with labor shortages and Union blockades, Rosewood was producing more cotton than it had in its most prosperous antebellum years. The three-story Greek Revival mansion, with its 6 towering Corinthian columns and double-tiered wraparound galleries, commanded a view of nearly 2,000 acres of the richest black soil in Middle Tennessee. The house itself was a masterpiece of antebellum architecture, featuring hand-carved Italian marble fireplaces, crystal chandeliers imported from France, and mahogany paneling that had been seasoned for 7 years before installation. Ezekiel Chamberlain had inherited more than just land from his father, Josiah. At 42, he possessed the calculating mind of a born businessman and the ruthless determination that had made the Chamberlain name synonymous with success throughout the Cumberland River Valley. Standing 6 feet tall with piercing gray eyes and prematurely silver hair, Ezekiel carried himself with the bearing of Southern aristocracy. But those who knew him well recognized something colder beneath the polished exterior. His hands, though soft from a life of privilege, bore unusual calluses not from honest labor, but from activities his neighbors would never have imagined. Unlike many plantation owners who had fled south as Union forces approached Nashville in February 1862, Ezekiel had remained, claiming neutrality while secretly negotiating cotton contracts with both Confederate quartermasters and Union procurement officers. His strategy was brilliant in its audaciousness. He sold cotton to the Confederates at inflated wartime prices, then sold the same cotton to Union forces when they intercepted Confederate supply trains, collecting payment twice for the same goods. But this was only the beginning of his elaborate deception. His wife, Margaret, a steel-willed woman from an old Virginia tobacco family, managed the domestic affairs with the precision of a military commander. At 38, she had been considered a great beauty in her youth, but the years had hardened her features into something that inspired more fear than admiration among the plantation's workers. She kept meticulous records of every aspect of household operations, from the weekly consumption of flour and molasses to the exact number of candles burned in each room. Her account books were works of art in themselves, filled with precise entries written in her distinctive copperplate handwriting. What those books didn't record, however, were the conversations she had with her husband late at night, planning operations that went far beyond the management of cotton and slaves. Their twin sons, Daniel and Samuel, both 21, had inherited their parents' cold intelligence but lacked the older generation's patience and subtlety. Daniel, the elder by 17 minutes, was a thin, nervous young man with his father's gray eyes and a habit of constantly adjusting his spectacles when he was planning something unpleasant. He had studied bookkeeping and chemistry at the University of Tennessee before the war interrupted his education knowledge that would prove invaluable to the family's secret enterprises. Samuel was broader and more physically imposing than his brother, with powerful shoulders and hands that seemed too large for his body. He had always been the more violent of the twins, the one who enjoyed the practical aspects of their father's business in ways that sometimes disturbed even Ezekiel. The spring of 1862 had brought chaos to Tennessee that seemed to offer unlimited opportunities for those clever enough to exploit the situation. Federal troops occupied Nashville, Confederate forces controlled much of the countryside, and the Cumberland River became a contested waterway where fortunes could be made or lost with a single cargo shipment. Most plantations had lost their enslaved workforce to Union lines or Confederate impressment, but somehow Rosewood Manor continued to operate at full capacity. Neighbors whispered about Ezekiel's seemingly endless supply of workers, men and women who appeared at dawn in the cotton fields and disappeared back into the quarters at dusk, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats and head wraps that made individual identification nearly impossible. The truth was more complex and far more sinister than anyone imagined. Following President Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862, Ezekiel had made a calculated decision that would seal his family's fate and the fate of dozens of innocent people seeking nothing more than honest work during desperate times. Rather than lose his enslaved workforce, he had begun offering wages to both freed slaves and white laborers desperate for employment in the war-torn economy. The offer was generous by wartime standards to $1 a day, plus room and board, more than most factory workers earned in Nashville or Memphis. But there was a catch that wasn't mentioned until after the contracts were signed. Workers agreed to remain on the plantation for a minimum of 2 years, with their wages held in trust until the completion of their service, what seemed like a reasonable arrangement to ensure stable labor during wartime soon revealed itself to be something far more sinister than even the most suspicious observer could have imagined. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came in November 1862 when Martha Henley, a widow from nearby Murfreesboro, arrived at the courthouse in town asking about her brother Thomas, a former blacksmith who had lost his shop to Union requisitions. Thomas had taken employment at Rosewood Manor 6 weeks earlier, promising to send word as soon as he received his first month's wages. Martha had received no letters, and when she had ridden out to the plantation to inquire about him, she was told by Daniel Chamberlain that Thomas had violated his contract by drinking and had been dismissed without pay the previous week. But Thomas ain't touched a drop of liquor in 7 years, Martha told Sheriff Coleman Briggs, her weathered hands trembling as she clutched a faded daguerreotype of her brother. The photograph showed a sturdy man with kind eyes and the calloused hands of a craftsman, not since our father died from the bottle. Thomas swore on Papa's grave he'd never drink again, and I believe him true as gospel. He was the most reliable man I ever knew. Never missed a day of work in his life. Never broke a promise to anyone. Sheriff Briggs, a thin man with prematurely gray hair who had known the Chamberlain family for 20 years, assured Martha that he would investigate. But something about her story bothered him. Thomas Henley had been well known in Murfreesboro as a skilled blacksmith and a man of his word. The idea that he would suddenly start drinking and abandon his responsibilities seemed completely out of character. Still, people sometimes change during wartime, and the stress of losing his livelihood might have driven Thomas back to the bottle, despite his best intentions. When Briggs rode out to Rosewood Manor that afternoon, he found Ezekiel Chamberlain waiting for him on the front steps of the mansion, dressed in his finest black suit and holding a leather-bound ledger. The plantation owner's timing seemed oddly convenient, almost as if he had been expecting this exact visit. "I anticipated your arrival," Sheriff Ezekiel said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of Virginia aristocracy despite 3 decades in Tennessee. Regrettably, Thomas Henley proved to be unreliable. "We discovered him stealing tools from the blacksmith shop and found a whiskey bottle hidden in his quarters. I have documentation of the incident signed by 3 witnesses." The sheriff examined the papers. Everything appeared to be in order. The signatures belonged to Samuel Chamberlain, the plantation's head overseer, Josiah Creek, and a field hand named Moses Washington, who claimed to have seen Thomas drinking behind the cotton gin on the night in question. The handwriting was consistent, the dates were correct, and the charges seemed detailed enough to be credible, but something bothered Sheriff Briggs about the encounter that he couldn't quite identify. Ezekiel's manner was prepared, rehearsed, as if he had been expecting this exact conversation and had spent considerable time planning his responses. His gray eyes never wavered from the sheriff's face, but there was something calculating in his gaze that suggested he was constantly evaluating how his words were being received. And there was something else, a smell that lingered around the plantation's outbuildings. Something chemical and sharp that seemed out of place among the usual odors of a working farm. It reminded Briggs of the smell that hung around the town's tannery, but more intense and somehow more unpleasant. "I hope you understand, Sheriff, that I cannot allow theft and drunkenness to go unpunished," Ezekiel continued, closing the ledger with a decisive snap. "Discipline is essential to maintaining order, especially during these troubled times." Thomas Henley was given every opportunity to reform his behavior, but he chose to squander that chance. Briggs nodded and tucked the papers into his coat pocket. But as he rode away from Rosewood Manor, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with Ezekiel's story. The documentation was too perfect, too convenient, and the witnesses too readily available. In his 15 years as sheriff, he had learned to trust his instincts. And every instinct he possessed was screaming that the Chamberlain family was hiding something. 3 days later, Martha Henley's body was discovered floating in Stones River, apparently the victim of a tragic accident while searching for her missing brother. Her horse was found grazing peacefully on the riverbank, and there were no signs of violence on her body. The coroner ruled it an accidental drowning, noting that the recent rains had made the river unusually swift and treacherous. But Sheriff Briggs noticed that Martha's reticule was missing, along with the daguerreotype of her brother that she had carried everywhere since his disappearance. The winter of 1862 to 1863 passed quietly at Rosewood Manor, but in the surrounding communities, more families began to report missing relatives. James Patterson, a carpenter from Shelbyville, had taken work at the plantation in December and had not been heard from since. His wife Sarah had received one letter in January, written in her husband's careful handwriting, promising that he was well and would return home as soon as his contract was completed. But no further letters arrived, and when Sarah made the difficult journey to Rosewood Manor in March, she was told that James had abandoned his position without notice, leaving behind his tools and personal belongings. Eleanora Walsh, a young Irish woman fleeing poverty in Nashville, had been hired as a seamstress in January and had vanished entirely. Her landlady reported that Eleanora had left her boarding house with a single carpetbag, excited about her new position at what she described as a grand plantation where they treat their workers like family. The landlady had expected Eleanora to return for her remaining possessions within a few weeks, but months passed with no word. Most disturbing of all, the Freeman family, Isaac, his wife Ruth, and their 2 teenage sons, Jacob and Benjamin, had been seen traveling toward Rosewood Manor in February, drawn by promises of generous wages for Isaac's skills as a cotton gin mechanic. The entire family had been hired together, with Ruth taking a position as a cook and the boys working as general laborers. They had sold their small farm near Franklin, loaded their possessions into a single wagon, and set off for what they believed would be a new and prosperous life. They were never seen again. Each time Sheriff Briggs investigated these disappearances, he found the same pattern. Ezekiel Chamberlain would produce carefully documented evidence of contract violations, theft, drinking, violence, or simply abandoning their posts without notice. The paperwork was always perfect, the witnesses always credible, and there was never any trace of the missing workers. It was as if they had simply vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind only carefully crafted stories of misconduct and betrayal. But Josiah Creek, the head overseer at Rosewood Manor, was beginning to harbor serious doubts about his employers. A massive man with arms like tree trunks and a face weathered by 40 years of outdoor labor, Creek had worked for the Chamberlain family since Ezekiel's father had purchased the plantation in 1834. He had seen the cruelties of the slave system and had participated in a share of brutal punishments. But what was happening at Rosewood Manor in 1863 was different. It was systematic, calculated, and utterly without conscience in ways that disturbed even a man who had spent his life enforcing the harsh discipline of plantation society. Creek first noticed the discrepancies in early March when he realized that the plantation's food stores were lasting much longer than they should have, given the supposed number of workers. According to the official records maintained by Daniel Chamberlain, there were 67 people employed at Rosewood Manor, not counting the family members and household staff. But when Creek began keeping his own careful count of the men and women laboring in the fields, he could account for no more than 39 actual people. Where were the other 28 workers? The answer came to him gradually through a series of observations that chilled him to the bone. Late at night, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning, he would see Daniel and Samuel Chamberlain moving through the workers' quarters with lanterns, always accompanied by 2 silent men Creek didn't recognize, pale, gaunt figures who seemed to appear and disappear like phantoms. These mysterious strangers wore the clothes of working men, but their hands were soft, and their movements suggested education and refinement rather than physical labor. Most unsettling of all, they carried leather satchels that seemed to contain medical or surgical instruments. These midnight visits always coincided with workers failing to appear for the morning roll call. Creek would go to their quarters to investigate, only to find the cabins empty and carefully cleaned, with no sign that anyone had ever lived there. Personal belongings, tools, extra clothing, everything would be gone, as if the missing workers had never existed at all. On a humid night in April 1863, Creek's growing suspicions finally drove him to follow the Chamberlain brothers as they made their rounds through the workers' quarters. Keeping to the shadows between the wooden buildings, he watched as Daniel and Samuel entered the cabin of a field hand named Benjamin Carver, a free black man from Memphis who had been asking too many questions about missing co-workers. Carver had been employed at Rosewood Manor for only 3 weeks, but he had already begun to notice the same discrepancies that troubled Creek. He had been asking other workers about friends who had simply disappeared, wondering aloud why the plantation's population seemed to fluctuate so dramatically from week to week. The 2 brothers emerged from Carver's cabin 20 minutes later, carrying what appeared to be a heavy canvas sack between them. Even in the dim moonlight, Creek could see dark stains on the fabric, and the way the sack bulged and shifted suggested it contained something far more substantial than clothing or personal belongings. Samuel was breathing heavily from the exertion, while Daniel kept glancing nervously over his shoulder as they made their way across the plantation grounds. Creek followed at a distance as they made their way toward the old family cemetery located on a hill overlooking the plantation's cotton gin. The cemetery was enclosed by a wrought iron fence and contained the graves of 3 generations of Chamberlains, their headstones carved from expensive marble imported from Georgia. But instead of stopping at the formal burial ground, the brothers continued into the woods beyond, where Creek could see the flicker of torchlight among the trees. Hidden behind a massive oak tree, Creek watched in growing horror as Daniel and Samuel were joined by their father, Ezekiel, and the 2 pale strangers he had observed during previous midnight excursions. Working with practiced efficiency, the group lowered the canvas sack into what was obviously a pre-dug grave. But this was no ordinary burial. As Creek watched, one of the pale men produced a large glass bottle filled with a clear liquid and began pouring it over the contents of the grave. The chemical smell that had bothered Sheriff Briggs during his investigation filled the air. The sharp, acrid odor of Quickleime. Ezekiel Chamberlain stood at the edge of the grave and spoke in a voice so low that Creek could barely make out the words. 73 souls to build an empire. Each one a brick in the foundation of our dynasty. What we do here tonight ensures that our family will prosper long after this war has been forgotten. When the grave was filled and carefully camouflaged with fallen leaves and transplanted forest undergrowth, the group separated. Ezekiel returned toward the main house, while his sons and the 2 strangers headed in the direction of a large barn that Creek had assumed was used for equipment storage, his curiosity now overcome by a terrible certainty about what he had witnessed. Creek crept toward the barn and peered through a gap in the wooden siding. What he saw inside would haunt him for the rest of his life and convince him that he was working for monsters who had abandoned every pretense of human decency. The barn had been converted into something that resembled a macabre factory designed for the systematic processing of human remains. Along one wall stood a series of large wooden vats filled with the same quicklime solution Creek had seen poured into the grave. The chemical was used to accelerate decomposition, breaking down organic matter and leaving no trace of the victims except for the valuables that could be recovered and resold. The vats were equipped with wooden paddles for stirring and metal grates for straining out items that wouldn't dissolve. Personal belongings, jewelry, tools, and even clothing were sorted into neat piles on long wooden tables. Creek could see familiar items among the carefully organized goods: Thomas Henley's distinctive leather tool belt, Eleanora Walsh's silver locket, and what appeared to be the Freeman family's wedding rings lined up in a small wooden box. In one corner, a small furnace glowed red-hot, used to melt down gold and silver items into unmarked ingots that could be sold without raising suspicions about their origin. But the most chilling discovery was a series of ledger books that lay open on a desk near the barn's entrance. In Daniel Chamberlain's meticulous handwriting, Creek could see entries that recorded not cotton production or livestock sales, but human lives reduced to nothing more than profit margins. Each entry included the victim's name, date of arrival, date of death, and a detailed inventory of their possessions along with estimated values. Thomas Henley, November 15, 1862. Tools and silver watch, $47. James Patterson, December 22, 1862. Carpenter tools and gold ring, $89. Eleanora Walsh, January 18, 1863, sewing supplies and silver locket, $23. Freeman family, February 8, 1863. Wagon, tools, household goods, personal effects, $156. The entries went on for pages, each representing a person who had come to Rosewood Manor seeking honest work and had instead found only death. The total value of goods recovered from 73 victims came to over $4,000, more than enough to explain the Chamberlain family's continued prosperity during the lean war years when most plantations were struggling to survive. But Creek realized that this wasn't just about money. The Chamberlains weren't desperate people driven to crime by wartime hardships. They were systematic killers who had developed an efficient method for disposing of inconvenient people while profiting from their deaths. The plantation wasn't a farm. It was a trap designed to lure victims with false promises of employment and security. As Creek continued to study the horrific contents of the barn, he began to understand the full scope of the Chamberlain family's operation. This wasn't a recent development driven by wartime desperation. The oldest entries in Daniel's ledger dated back to 1861, suggesting that the murders had been going on for nearly 2 years. The family had perfected their system through trial and error, learning from early mistakes to create an almost foolproof method for eliminating witnesses and disposing of evidence. The two pale strangers were identified in the ledger as Dr. Cornelius Polk and his brother Edgar, former Confederate medical officers who had deserted their unit after the Battle of Shiloh. Cornelius had been a practicing physician in Kentucky before the war, while Edgar had studied chemistry at Transylvania University. Their medical knowledge and understanding of chemical processes made them invaluable partners in the Chamberlain's gruesome enterprise. They were responsible for the actual killings, administering carefully measured doses of chloroform or morphine that left no obvious signs of violence on the victims' bodies. Creek discovered that the Chamberlains' recruitment methods were far more sophisticated than he had imagined. They placed advertisements in newspapers throughout Tennessee and Kentucky, offering generous wages and ideal working conditions. They specifically targeted people who were isolated or desperate widows, recent immigrants, freed slaves with no family connections, and skilled workers who had lost their livelihoods to the war. The victims were chosen not just for their possessions, but for their vulnerability, people who wouldn't be missed, at least not immediately. The family had also established relationships with unscrupulous boarding house operators and labor contractors who would recommend Rosewood Manor to potential victims in exchange for a small commission. These accomplices helped identify people with valuable skills or possessions, providing the Chamberlains with detailed information about potential targets before they even arrived at the plantation. As Creek absorbed the magnitude of what he had discovered, he realized that he was looking at evidence of the most systematic and coldly calculated mass murder operation in American history. The Chamberlains weren't just killing for money. They were running what amounted to a human slaughterhouse, luring desperate workers to their plantation with false promises and then disposing of them once their belongings had been inventoried and cataloged. But as he backed away from the barn, Creek's boot caught on a loose board, sending a sharp crack echoing through the night air. Inside the barn, the voices fell silent. Creek heard footsteps approaching the door and realized with growing terror that he had been discovered. "Who's out there?" Daniel Chamberlain's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "Samuel, check the perimeter. Take the dogs and make sure whoever it is doesn't get away." Creek ran, crashing through the underbrush as the sound of barking hounds filled the night air behind him. He could hear Samuel Chamberlain shouting orders to the dogs, urging them to follow the scent of the intruder who had discovered their family's terrible secret. Creek's only advantage was his intimate knowledge of the plantation's layout, gained through nearly 30 years of working the land. He knew every path, every fence line, every hiding place that might offer temporary shelter, but he also knew that the Chamberlains wouldn't stop hunting him until they found him. And when they did, he would become victim number 74 in Daniel's meticulous ledger. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Rutherford County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Creek's discovery has revealed the true nature of the Chamberlain family's business, but his desperate flight through the Tennessee woods is just beginning. Let's discover together what happens next. Creek's desperate flight through the woods was cut short when he stumbled over a fallen log and crashed into a shallow ravine, his left leg twisting beneath him with an audible snap that echoed through the night air. As he lay gasping in pain at the bottom of the creek bed, he could hear the baying of bloodhounds getting closer. The Chamberlain's hunting dogs had his scent, and it was only a matter of time before they found him. Worse yet, he could hear human voices approaching Samuel Chamberlain's distinctive baritone calling out orders and the higher-pitched responses of the Polk brothers as they coordinated their search. He can't have gone far. Samuel's voice carried clearly through the still night air. The dogs have his trail, and there's nowhere for him to hide. When we find him, we'll make sure it looks like an accident, maybe a fall from his horse while checking the fence lines. What if he's already told someone what he saw? Edgar Polk's nervous tenor revealed his growing anxiety about their exposure. Then we'll have to expand our cleanup operation. Ezekiel Chamberlain's cultured voice joined the conversation as he arrived at the search site. But I doubt Creek has had time to tell anyone anything. He's a simple man who keeps to himself. Even if he disappears, it won't cause the kind of investigation that could threaten our operation. Creek pressed himself deeper into the muddy bottom of the ravine, trying to ignore the excruciating pain in his broken leg while he listened to the three men plan his murder with the same casual efficiency they had used to eliminate 73 other innocent people. He understood now that he had stumbled into something far worse than simple greed or wartime opportunism. The Chamberlain family had created a systematic killing operation that treated human life as nothing more than a renewable resource to be harvested and processed, but fate intervened in the form of Corporal William Hayes, a Union cavalry scout who had been observing Rosewood Manor for 3 days as part of a reconnaissance mission ordered by Major General William Rosecrans. Hayes had been tasked with documenting Confederate supply operations in the area, and the unusual level of activity around the Chamberlain plantation had caught his attention. He had noticed the frequent arrivals of new workers, the late night movements between buildings, and the strange chemical smells that seemed to emanate from the plantation's outbuildings. When Hayes heard the commotion in the woods, the barking dogs, the shouting voices, and the sounds of a major search operation, he assumed he was witnessing the capture of a runaway slave or perhaps a Confederate deserter. His orders were to observe and report, not to intervene in local affairs. But something about the urgency and violence of the search convinced him to investigate. Hayes found Creek at the bottom of the ravine, his leg clearly broken and his clothes torn from his desperate flight through the underbrush. At first, the soldier assumed the injured man was a runaway slave who had been caught stealing or attempting to escape. But Creek's desperate urgency and his detailed knowledge of the plantation's operations quickly convinced Hayes that something far more serious was taking place. They're killing folks for their belongings, Creek gasped, clutching Hayes's uniform jacket with hands that shook from pain and terror. 73 people dead and buried in unmarked graves scattered through these woods. You got to stop them before they kill more innocent folks. They got a whole operation set up, chemicals to dissolve the bodies, ledger books keeping track of what they steal. Everything organized like it was a regular business. Hayes helped Creek onto his horse, and together they rode toward Nashville, with Creek providing detailed directions to federal authorities while fighting to remain conscious despite the pain from his broken leg. Initially, the Union officers dismissed Creek's story as the ravings of a disgruntled overseer or perhaps a Confederate sympathizer attempting to discredit a loyal plantation owner. But Creek's specific knowledge of the plantation's layout, his detailed descriptions of the barn's contents, and his ability to provide exact locations for dozens of unmarked graves eventually convinced Major General Rosecrans to authorize a full military investigation. The general had heard rumors about irregular activities at various plantations throughout Tennessee, but nothing on the scale that Creek was describing. If even half of what the overseer claimed was true, then the Chamberlain family was operating what amounted to a private concentration camp designed to systematically murder and rob innocent civilians during wartime. Such an operation would constitute war crimes of the highest order, regardless of which side the perpetrators claimed to support. On May 15, 1863, a full company of Union infantry surrounded Rosewood Manor while Creek, despite his broken leg, led a team of investigators to the converted barn. What they found exceeded even Creek's horrific descriptions and shocked military investigators who thought they had seen every possible atrocity that human beings could inflict upon one another. The barn contained evidence of an operation so systematic and coldly efficient that it redefined the investigators' understanding of organized murder. In addition to the quicklime vats and sordid belongings that Creek had described, they discovered detailed maps showing the locations of 73 graves scattered throughout the wooded areas surrounding the plantation. Each grave was marked with a simple wooden stake bearing a number that corresponded to entries in Daniel Chamberlain's ledger books. The ledgers themselves contained not just inventories of stolen goods, but detailed notes about the victims, their skills, their family situations, and even their physical characteristics. The investigators found evidence that the Chamberlains had been experimenting with different methods of killing their victims, apparently seeking the most efficient approach that would leave the fewest traces. Early entries described crude poisonings and staged accidents, but later records showed increasing sophistication in both the murders and the disposal of evidence. The Polk brothers had brought medical expertise that allowed the family to kill their victims quickly and quietly using drugs that mimicked natural death or accident. Perhaps most chilling of all, the investigators discovered a detailed business plan written in Ezekiel Chamberlain's own handwriting outlining his vision for expanding the operation after the war ended. He had calculated that the massive displacement of population during Reconstruction would create perfect conditions for systematic murder on an even larger scale. Freed slaves seeking work, displaced whites trying to rebuild their lives, immigrants arriving from Europe would provide a steady stream of vulnerable victims who could be eliminated without triggering major investigations. But when the soldiers attempted to arrest the family, they found Rosewood Manor abandoned. The Chamberlains had fled during the night, apparently warned by accomplices in town who had observed the military preparations. They had taken with them only what they could carry on horseback, abandoning a fortune in cotton, livestock, and machinery. More importantly, they had left behind evidence of their crimes that would shock even hardened military investigators accustomed to the brutalities of civil war. The two pale strangers who had assisted the Chamberlains were identified as Dr. Cornelius Polk and his brother Edgar, former Confederate medical officers who had deserted their unit after the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. Military records showed that both men had been reported as missing in action, but Creek's testimony revealed that they had actually been recruited by the Chamberlains to provide medical expertise for their killing operation. Their bodies were discovered 3 days after the raid, floating in the Cumberland River with their throats cut, apparently silenced by their former employers to eliminate potential witnesses who could testify about the family's crimes. The excavation of the 73 graves took nearly 3 weeks and required engineers borrowed from the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad. The quicklime had done its work well in most cases. Only fragments of bone and clothing remained to testify to the victim's existence, but those fragments were enough to confirm Creek's testimony and provide some measure of closure to the families, who had spent months wondering about their missing relatives. The investigation revealed that the Chamberlain operation had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined. They had accomplices in Nashville, Memphis, Louisville, and even as far away as St. Louis. Boarding house operators, labor contractors, and newspaper publishers who helped identify and recruit potential victims. The network had been operating for nearly 2 years and had generated profits that allowed the family to live in luxury while most of their neighbors struggled with wartime shortages. Federal authorities launched a massive manhunt for the Chamberlain family, offering substantial rewards for information leading to their capture. Wanted posters bearing their photographs were distributed throughout the South and as far north as Canada, but the family seemed to have vanished as completely as their victims. Some reports placed them in Mexico, others claimed they had fled. to South America, and a few witnesses swore they had seen Ezekiel Chamberlain boarding a ship in Mobile bound for Europe with forged British passports. The truth about their ultimate fate was never established. Rumors persisted for decades about sightings in various locations, but none were ever confirmed. Some historians believe they died during their flight, possibly killed by Confederate forces, who considered them traitors, or by Union troops who had orders to shoot them on sight. Others suggest they successfully escaped to a foreign country where they lived out their lives under assumed names, their stolen wealth allowing them to start over in anonymity. Rosewood Manor was seized by federal authorities and converted into a military hospital for Union wounded. The irony was not lost on anyone that a house built on the profits of systematic murder would spend the remainder of the war serving as a place of healing. The plantation's cotton fields were divided among freed slaves and white refugees who had lost their homes to the war, creating a community of small farmers who worked together to overcome the legacy of horror that had stained the land. The mansion itself, with its gleaming white columns and elegant galleries, stood empty for nearly 20 years after the war ended. Local residents avoided the property, claiming it was cursed by the spirits of the murdered victims. Several attempts to restore the house and grounds failed when workers reported strange noises, unexplained accidents, and an overwhelming sense of dread that made it impossible to complete their tasks. Finally, in 1884, the property was purchased by the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, and the mansion was demolished to make way for a rail yard and switching station. Today, nothing remains of the Chamberlain dynasty except for a small historical marker erected by the state of Tennessee. In 1963, exactly 100 years after the discovery of the 73 graves, the marker, located on what is now a busy commercial street in Murfreesboro, reads simply, "In memory of the victims of Rosewood Manor, their names are known to God. Most people who pass the marker have no idea of the horror it commemorates." But local historians still tell the story of the cotton fortune built on unmarked graves. Josiah Creek, the overseer whose courage exposed the Chamberlain's crimes, survived the war and spent his remaining years working with federal authorities to locate the families of the victims and help them understand what had happened to their missing relatives. The broken leg he suffered during his desperate flight through the Tennessee woods never healed properly, and he walked with a pronounced limp for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the night he discovered that the pursuit of wealth could transform human beings into something far more monstrous than any creature of legend or folklore. Creek's testimony at the subsequent military tribunal was instrumental in establishing legal precedents for prosecuting war crimes. Though the Chamberlain family themselves were never brought to justice, he spent countless hours with military investigators, helping them understand the full scope of the killing operation and identify accomplices throughout the region. Many of these accomplices were eventually captured and tried, though most received relatively light sentences in exchange for their cooperation in revealing the extent of the network. The psychological toll of what he had witnessed and participated in, however indirectly, haunted Creek for the remainder of his life. He never married, never had children, and rarely spoke about his experiences except when required to testify. In legal proceedings, neighbors described him as a man who seemed to carry an invisible burden, someone who had seen too much of human evil to ever fully trust in human goodness again. In 1889, 26 years after the discovery of the graves, Creek was found dead in his small cabin near what had once been the Rosewood Manor property. He had left behind a final written testament, sealed and addressed to the Tennessee State Historical Society with instructions that it not be opened until after his death. The document, written in Creek's careful handwriting, provided additional details about the Chamberlain operation that he had never revealed during his official testimony. According to Creek's final statement, the 73 known victims represented only a portion of the Chamberlain family's crimes. He estimated that the actual number of people murdered at Rosewood Manor was closer to 100, with the additional victims being transients, runaway slaves, and other individuals whose disappearances would never be reported to authorities. The family had been particularly careful to target people who existed on the margins of society, individuals whose deaths would cause minimal disruption to the normal functioning of the community. Creek's testament also revealed that he had suspected the murders were taking place for months before he actually witnessed them. He had noticed the discrepancies in food consumption, the mysterious late-night activities, and the way certain workers would simply vanish without explanation, but he had been too frightened of the Chamberlain family's power and influence to act on his suspicions until the evidence became overwhelming. Most disturbing of all, Creek's final statement suggested that the Chamberlains had not been unique in their crimes. He claimed to have heard rumors about similar operations at other plantations throughout the South, places where wartime chaos provided cover for systematic murder and theft. These rumors were never fully investigated, but they raised the chilling possibility that the Rosewood Manor murders were part of a much larger pattern of exploitation and violence that historians have only begun to understand. The Chamberlain case stands as one of the most shocking examples of systematic murder in American history, a reminder that the greatest horrors are often perpetrated not by madmen or fanatics, but by calculating individuals who reduce human life to nothing more than entries in a ledger book. In the chaos of civil war, with communities scattered and authorities overwhelmed, the Chamberlains created their own private kingdom of terror where desperate people seeking honest work found only death. What makes their crimes particularly heinous was not just the scale of the killing, but the coldly businesslike approach they took to murder. These were not crimes of passion or acts of wartime desperation, but calculated business decisions made by people who viewed other human beings as nothing more than sources of profit. The meticulous record-keeping, the systematic disposal of evidence, and the careful selection of vulnerable victims all point to a level of premeditation that defies comprehension. The psychological profiles that modern criminologists have constructed of the Chamberlain family members suggest that they were classic examples of organized serial killers who operated as a group. Ezekiel appears to have been the mastermind, a charismatic leader who convinced his family that their crimes were justified by their need to maintain their social position and economic prosperity. Margaret served as the operational manager, handling the logistics of the killing operation with the same efficiency she brought to managing household affairs. The twin sons, Daniel and Samuel, represented different aspects of the criminal personality. Daniel, the meticulous record keeper who reduced murder to bookkeeping, and Samuel, the enforcer who enjoyed the physical aspects of their crimes. The involvement of the Polk brothers adds another layer of horror to the story, demonstrating how professional medical knowledge could be perverted in service of systematic murder. Their desertion from Confederate medical service and subsequent partnership with the Chamberlains shows how the chaos of wartime could provide opportunities for individuals to reinvent themselves in the most sinister ways possible. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that the Chamberlain operation might have continued indefinitely if not for Josiah Creek's accidental discovery of their crimes. The family had created such an efficient system for eliminating witnesses and disposing of evidence that they might have murdered hundreds more victims before finally being exposed. The fact that they nearly escaped justice entirely and may have successfully fled to live out their lives in comfort elsewhere demonstrates how difficult it can be to hold such calculating criminals accountable for their actions. The legacy of the Rosewood Manor murders extends far beyond the immediate tragedy of the 73 known victims. The case helped establish important legal precedents for prosecuting organized crime and war crimes, concepts that would become increasingly important in the 20th century. The systematic nature of the Chamberlain operation and the family's use of legitimate business structures to conceal their crimes provided a template that law enforcement agencies would use to understand and combat similar criminal enterprises. The story also serves as a sobering reminder of how economic desperation can make people vulnerable to exploitation by those who lack basic human decency. The victims of the Chamberlain operation were not wealthy or powerful people who might have been targeted for political reasons. They were ordinary working people who had lost their livelihoods to war and were seeking nothing more than honest employment to support themselves and their families. Their trust in the promises of generous wages and fair treatment made them easy targets for a family that had abandoned every principle of human morality in pursuit of profit. In the years following the Civil War, as the country struggled to rebuild and come to terms with the massive human cost of the conflict, the Rosewood Manor murders served as a stark reminder that some of the war's worst atrocities had been committed not by soldiers on battlefields, but by civilians who used the chaos of war to conceal their own private crimes against humanity. This mystery shows us that evil often wears a respectable face and hides behind the veneer of social respectability. The Chamberlains were not wild-eyed killers or deranged psychopaths. They were methodical businessmen who simply viewed murder as another form of commerce. Their crimes remind us that vigilance against such calculated evil is the price of civilization itself, and that we must never become so comfortable with prosperity and social stability that we forget to watch for those who would exploit the vulnerable for their own gain. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the Chamberlain family's ultimate fate was justice, or should they have faced trial for their crimes? Do you think there were other operations like this during the Civil War that were never discovered? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this dark chapter in Tennessee history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who look just like ordinary people. See you in the next video.